Hello, woodland friends, and welcome to another session of Back Porch Forestry. I'm Dr. David Mercker, Extension Forester with the University of Tennessee. It's great to have this chance to visit with you, to chat with you today, just about forests and forestry. You are unique. The title of forest landowner is one not held by many people. Your ownership carries with it a sense of treasure, a sense of enjoyment, maybe even a sense of wildness, but it's also a privilege. One that imparts responsibility, one that can be observed, and one that increasingly can be measured. If you were to be judged on your forestry practices, how would you score? Would you even know which parameters to assess or which questions to ask? 4 years ago, Back Porch Forestry was created to help you with these questions. My goal has been to educate you on trees and forests and forest management. When this video goes live, there will be 34 sessions of Back Porch Forestry. I hope that you've enjoyed them. I hope that you've learned from them. And I hope that you implement now your new knowledge. This will likely be the final session of Back Porch Forestry, and I've saved the best for last. This is a subject that's kind of dear to my heart. It's very important to me and addresses which trees to harvest and which trees to leave when conducting a partial cutting in hardwood forest. It's titled Classifying Your Hardwood Timber for Harvesting Purposes. Let me share the presentation with you, and we will launch into this. Back Porch Forestry. For most landowners, forest landowners, the opportunity to harvest their hardwood timber does not happen very often. Species such as oak and hickory, maple, poplar, cherry, and others require decades to reach their financial maturity. Waiting for the crop to mature requires patience. When the time arrives, knowing which trees to harvest and which to retain for future revenue can be challenging. Timber harvesting typically occurs either to thin, immature stands, oftentimes called partial harvesting or thinning, or it occurs to regenerate mature stands, usually called a clear-cut harvest or a regeneration harvest. This presentation focuses on partial harvesting, specifically how to determine which timber to liquidate and which to hold for future timber revenue. Putnam and others in 1960 developed 4 classes of timber to aid foresters and landowners with the decision of identifying timber either for harvest or for retention. Putnam's 4 timber classes were established with timber production as the primary goal, although the categories could be modified to suit wildlife or other goals. The 4 classes include cutting stock, preferred growing stock, reserve growing stock, and cull stock. Understanding of the term growing stock is central to following Putnam's model. Think of growing stock as timber found in the forest that is not to be harvested at the moment, but is being held over either for future harvest or to protect and enhance other timber that is intended for future harvest. In a broad sense, growing stock is either acceptable or unacceptable based on species, the composition of the forest, maturity, health, and other factors. Overstocked is a term, it represents a stand that's overcrowded. In other words, it's beyond 100% stocking, thus reducing tree growth and vigor. The second category is fully stocked. Now, this is a situation where a stand of trees is effectively occupying most of the growing space, yet some space remains for further crown expansion and growth of developing crop trees. For example, a stand fully stocked at 70% can grow suitably until reaching 100% stocking. Typically, foresters like to operate or manage hardwood forest in the fully stocked range. And then finally, understocked. This is a stand in which the crop trees do not fully occupy the growing space. Thus, the stand growth is not maximized. Tree form or grade may even be compromised. For example, a stand of trees that remains following a heavy diameter limit cut might be understocked. In other words, there's just too much growing space available for the trees to grow properly. The concept of forest stocking is complex, as you can tell, and it's advised for you to work with professional foresters for a more thorough understanding and an implementation. The profession of forestry developed tables for measuring adequate stocking, forest stocking, and foresters are familiar with these tables. So let's begin in looking through these 4 different cutting stock categories, and we begin with actually cutting stock. Cutting stock is timber that is ready for harvest now. Such trees are not likely to increase in value and may even decline if retained for future harvest. Meadows and others in 1999 summarized cutting stock as trees that may be in poor condition, may pose a significant risk of mortality or degrade in merchantability, or may be of a species that is just unsuitable for the site or for the management objectives. This class includes trees that are overmature, damaged, diseased, poorly formed, otherwise undesirable, what I have typically called in these back porch forestry the D trees. They are likely to die or to suffer significant decay or degrade in the near future and are therefore expected to decrease in value if left after partial cutting. An example of cutting stock could include a large diameter oak with top branches that are beginning to senesce. It could also include any species with poor or crooked form, maybe it's full of defects, or just growing adjacent to and hindering a tree that's classed as preferred growing stock, which takes us into the next category, preferred growing stock. So timber that's not yet chosen for harvest, but has a very good potential for future harvest is termed preferred growing stock. These trees are healthy and growing vigorously, are of desirable species with good form and grade, and have strong crown position with little risk of dying. Preferred stock is increasing in value steadily or even exponentially and is therefore left for a future cutting. An example of preferred growing stock could include high quality 12 to 20 inch oak trees measured at diameter breast height, which we call DBH. Maybe these trees would be growing on a desirable site with outstanding form and grade, so they're straight and clear of defects, and have a favorable crown position, meaning the crown is either dominant or co-dominant. In other words, their crowns are up there receiving adequate sunlight. These are favorable investments. With sound management and the absence of disturbance, such trees can produce promising financial return. Here's an example of a cherry bark oak that qualifies as preferred growing stock. Reserve growing stock, the next category, includes timber that is not to be harvested right now and is generally in good condition, but for various reasons just does not meet the landowner objectives. Such timber may have a lower market value due to being an undesirable species or having poor form and or grade. However, reserve growing stock may be needed to maintain proper stand stocking for continued development of the preferred growing stock and is therefore retained. An example of reserve growing stock could include a generally undesirable sycamore, beech, or sweet gum tree, or a poor quality desirable species such as oak, and is retained to maintain proper forest stocking in order to protect the preferred growing stock. Such trees generally do not meet landowner objectives. Here's an example of a reserve stock. It's tulip poplar. It has more knots that is desirable, but there's really not much around it to release, so it's retained as reserve growing stock for the next time. Well, timber that has declined to the point that it cannot meet management objectives and is not needed to maintain desired stocking is classified as cull stock. A cull is a tree of merchantable size, which, because of defect, is mostly useless for the intended purpose of timber production. Sound cull stock might have some usable wood and therefore may be harvested for lower value products such as pallets, pulpwood, or even firewood. Unsound culls have no value for wood production. When cull stock cannot be salvaged, in other words, harvested to generate some revenue, often the decision is either to deaden it, such as timber stand improvement, or if not too abundant, Leave some culls that could just be retained for wildlife value, particularly when den holes are present. An example of cull stock might include timber with interior that's become excessively hollow, such as this example. Trees with excessive branching or cupping or even rot are also examples. So then the question becomes, well, which trees should be selected for sale? This is somewhat complicated. Once a landowner and their forester have made a general assessment of the stand of timber, the duty of selecting trees for harvest can begin. Dr. Wayne Clatterbuck, 2007, makes the following recommendations for determining which trees to cut versus leave. First, harvest all cutting stock and cull stock, unless the retention of some of them is needed for visual or wildlife values. Next, to enhance future timber sale incomes, few, if any, of the preferred growing stock should be harvested. An exception might be when an impending threat exists. So, for instance, if an insects or disease, maybe something like the emerald ash borer is moving in and is eradicating the ash, well, you might want to go ahead and cut them even though they're not quite ready. Also, on occasion, some preferred growing stock might be harvested if found growing adjacent to another preferred growing stock and additional growing space is just needed. Further, a temporary spike in market prices may justify harvesting preferred growing stock before you normally would. And then finally, reserve growing stock may either be harvested or left to grow. Often reserve stock is retained in order to maintain adequate stocking around the preferred growing stock trees. Sometimes, however, including some reserve growing stock to enrich a timber sale that is otherwise heavily composed of less desirable timber may make a timber sale more attractive to potential buyers. In other words, sweeten the pot a little bit in order to make a sale feasible. Well, I'm going to conclude with a series of examples of photographs with trees and then explain which class that I feel they belong to. Now, other foresters might have a different opinion, and you might even disagree. But test what you've learned so far by looking at these photographs. This is an obvious cull stock. There's no lumber value, but it does have excellent wildlife value. Notice all the den holes in this tree. I would call that an apartment complex. It would be a good category just to leave. It's cull stock, but leave it for wildlife. The next example is what I'm calling preferred growing stock. This is a fine example of preferred growing stock. It's an 18-inch DBH northern red oak. It has all the qualities for a tree that should be retained for future timber sale. It's good form, good grade, good species, and has good crown position. That tree would be a good candidate for sale with the next timber harvest. Third, not only has this white oak reached financial maturity in terms of its size, DBH, but a recent lightning strike further qualifies this tree as cutting stock. You can see some rot has begun to occur in the wood inside that lightning strike. And so that's a good candidate to go ahead and harvest and convert that to a usable wood product. Cutting stock. Now, both of these trees, at least by my recommendation, are classed as cutting stock. The northern red oak to the right is financially mature, while the red maple to the left is just not a species that meets the land ownership objectives, and it should be cut. It's not very large, but it's a tree that does have some merchantability, and take them both out, classified as cutting stock at the same time. Now, the southern red oak to the right is cutting stock. The white oak to the left, I'm classifying as preferred growing stock, and it will be retained for future timber sale. So this is a dry site. Let's cut the red oak out before they succumb to drought, hypoxia, and canker. And let's leave some of these white oak for future sale. Here we have an American elm tree that is classed as cutting stock for three reasons. First, it's an undesirable species of low value, so that automatically qualifies it. Secondly, it has reached a large diameter in size. The DBH of that tree is about 24 inches in diameter. And And then finally, it's just a tree that's of very poor form. You see multiple forks in that tree as well. So it's not likely to improve in grade or value. So I would classify that as a cutting stock. If we don't harvest that tree, but we leave it, instead harvesting other trees, that's of course what we call high grading, which degrades the long-term potential of the forest and something that should be avoided. This 24-inch DBH white oak is also cutting stock. It's financially mature and has numerous knots as you look up that tree, limb knots, and it's just not going to improve in grade in the long run, and probably not going to improve in size either much. It's reaching its maturity. So let's harvest that tree and make space for additional trees to grow. With this example, the 18-inch DBH cherry bark oak to the right is preferred growing stock, good candidate to leave. Now the 12-inch DBH sweet gum to the left is a tougher decision. It could either be classed as reserve growing stock, in other words, we'll retain it and harvest it down the road. But if that tree is competing with the crown of the oak tree, then you might want to cut it and call it cutting stock, and this would release the crown of the red oak for improved growth. So the forest would have to evaluate that on a site-by-site, tree-by-tree basis. Here we have a tree that's classed as cull stock. It has a hollow trunk. It's also, and I know that because I hammered on that tree, and it's hollow almost all the way up that tree. But there's also another hollow spot at the sharp bend near the top of the tree. If you stand back, you'll actually see a hole up there. And it has excessive number of knots. So that tree is cull. The question becomes, do you leave it for wildlife? If you don't have very many trees like that, you might wish to do that. But if you have enough of them, then that tree could just be killed and then shift its growth over to an adjacent tree. The cherry bark oak trees marked with orange paint in this photograph all qualify as preferred growing stock. These are desirable species, have good form, they're straight, they have great grade, very few knots and defects, with strong crown position, and they're even well spaced. These trees are growing at their maximum potential. They're about 16 to 18 inches in diameter. Let's leave those trees. Those are preferred growing stock that will be great investments for a future timber harvest. Now, the three darker colored red oaks are kind of hard to see here, but you can pick out the three darker colored red oaks in this photograph are all cutting stock. This side is very dry, and the red oak are succumbing to hypoxia and canker, so they're dying. Most of the white oak trees could be retained for a future timber sale. Some of the white oak could be classed as preferred growing stock, good candidates, while others are reserve growing stock. The sycamore trees, the two sycamore trees in the center of this photo are reserve growing stock. These trees were retained rather than being cut because there was just no preferred growing stock nearby to release. In other words, no benefit could be derived by cutting this tree, so why not just leave them for the next timber harvest? It's hard to tell their diameter. They are right at 14 inches DBH, so we'll leave them for the next time. They are reserve growing stock. Now, I want you to notice in these photographs, this is actually the exact same site. These photographs are side by side, and they appear on the same side and were taken 15 years apart. If you'll notice, in each photograph, there is a deer stand ladder. There it is right there, and there it is right there. The pictures are taken from a slightly different angle, but it's the exact same site. Now, the left photo was taken immediately following a partial timber harvest. You'll see a treetop laying there that indicates that trees have been harvested. And the two red oaks in that photograph were retained as preferred growing stock at that time. Good candidates to retain. Now in the right photo, 15 years later, the same two trees have advanced to cutting stock now. You notice the foresters are marking those trees for harvest. They've retained or reached the financial maturity. So mission accomplished in this case. Well, as always, private forest landowners are encouraged to work with professional foresters when considering selling some timber. Determining which trees to harvest and which trees to retain really is a complicated process and involves a great deal of science. Foresters are trained to understand the various aspects of silviculture and forest management. So we do have a survey, and of course I ask you to complete that survey if you'd like. And also this presentation, you can delve into it in greater detail because it's summarized in a publication by the same title, and there is the URL to help you find it, or you can just Google the title and my last name and you'll find it. So thank you very much for your attention today and throughout all of these back porch forestry sessions. It's been a pleasure to work with you, to teach you, and I wish you the best of luck with your forest management activities.